"You people have no right to be here!" I shouted across the dusty ranch entrance, my voice cracking with fury, as a fleet of bulldozers rolled over what used to be my grandfather's tomato fields. The man in the suit didn't flinch. He adjusted his sunglasses, scribbled something on his clipboard, and gave a simple nod. The machines continued. "My name is Daniel Carter, and until last month I was just a man trying to honor my family's legacy. Now, I'm something else entirely. District attorney for the very county trying to erase our land from the map. I never asked for a war, but when the Redwood Valley HOA decided my family's ranch was better suited for a luxury golf course, they started one. The day it began was dry, the sky hazy with distant wildfire smoke. I'd driven up from my office in Sacramento after a frantic call from my cousin Ellie, who still worked the ranch full-time. Her voice shook. "Daniel, they're out here. Tractors, HOA reps. They've got paperwork." "Paperwork for what?" "For our land, Daniel. They're saying we sold." The line went dead. I barely remember the 3-hour drive up through the backroads of Redwood County. When I arrived, everything felt surreal. Orange flags lined the fields, staked in tight, ominous rows like markers for a graveyard. A large vinyl banner flapped arrogantly in the breeze. "Coming soon. The Pines at Redwood. 18 holes of heaven, 9-hole driving range, clubhouse, spa." They were turning my grandfather's ranch into a playground for the elite. I confronted the lead rep, a woman in an immaculate blazer with a name badge that read Marla Kent, Redwood Valley HOA Development Director. "Who gave you authority to build here?" I demanded. She looked me over, clearly unimpressed. "The land was legally purchased through eminent domain authorization. You'll find all documents have been properly filed with the county. The former owners were compensated." "Compensated? That land has been in my family for 4 generations. No one sold anything." She smiled tightly. "Then someone better check their records." That phrase echoed in my ears for days. I didn't sleep. I tore through every document my grandfather left behind. Old deeds, letters, even tax receipts. The HOA was betting on one thing: that no one would know where to look. Back in the county office, I pulled rank for the first time as district attorney. I requested access to sealed records, and what I found chilled me to my core. The HOA had been working with a private contractor to rezone parts of Redwood Valley, quietly. No public notice, no hearings, just silent transactions between corrupt board members and a few conveniently cooperative officials. The ranch hadn't been sold. It had been reclassified as abandoned land due to extended inactivity, then purchased at auction by a shell company tied to the HOA's vice president. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about golf or money. It was about power. I drove straight back to the ranch. Ellie met me at the gate, tear-streaked and furious. Behind her, the construction crews were laughing, leaning against bulldozers, smoking, acting like they already owned the place. I stood on the hood of my car and shouted so the entire valley could hear me. "This land is not abandoned. This land is not for sale, and you've just committed a felony by trespassing on a DA's property under fraudulent pretense." Silence fell. Even Marla Kent paled when I flashed my badge. But I wasn't there to scare. I was there to warn, because this time, they'd picked the wrong family. And I wasn't just some grieving grandson. I was the law now. And this was just the beginning. I barely slept that night. The dusty couch in Grandpa's study creaked beneath me with every twist and turn. Outside, the wind howled across the now silent farmland, brushing through the cornfields like a warning. I sat up around 5 a.m., exhausted but wired. The deed, the surveys, the letter. Everything pointed to one impossible truth. The Redwood Valley HOA didn't just cross a line, they bulldozed through it. I knew the next move had to be legal. By 9 a.m. I was back at Robert Mitchell's office, documents in hand, determination in my chest. He greeted me with a nod, less formal than before. "You weren't exaggerating," he said, holding the 1972 survey Grandpa had hidden. "This changes everything." We spent the next hour combing through the details. Robert compared the old boundary lines to the current county records. His jaw tightened as he measured the encroachment. Not just the new development, they had already paved over at least 60 acres of our land years ago, with zero trace of a sale. "This isn't just negligence," he muttered. "This is deliberate theft. And whoever authorized it? They knew exactly what they were doing." I leaned forward. "So how do we stop them?" He picked up the phone and made 2 calls. One to a county judge. The second to an independent surveyor from out of state. Someone HOA couldn't influence. "We'll get the court to issue a preliminary injunction. That means immediate halt to all construction. But Ethan," he looked at me seriously, "you need to be ready for what happens next." "What do you mean?" He hesitated. "They won't fight fair. People like Diane Reynolds never do." By the afternoon, the court order was in hand. I drove back to the construction site with the paper clutched tight in my fingers. The land looked worse than I remembered. Ripped open, flattened, humiliated. Bulldozers moved in synchronized motions like a machine army chewing up my family's soul. Diane's sleek black SUV was parked beside the HOA trailer. Perfect. I parked beside it and walked calmly toward her. A few workers stopped to watch. Diane stepped out, her manicured fingers still gripping her phone. "You again," she said, sighing theatrically. "I thought I'd drop this off personally," I said, extending the paper. She took it slowly, read it. Her lips tightened. "A court injunction?" she said, voice flat. "Effective immediately. Your crews are trespassing." For the first time I saw it, just a flicker in her eyes. Doubt. "We'll appeal," she said, folding the paper too neatly. "This is a temporary delay." "Maybe. But it's your blueprint that's built on stolen land." She tilted her head slightly. "You're a lot more trouble than I expected, Mr. Walker." I smiled. "You have no idea." Back at the farmhouse, I called Mrs. Harris. I needed to know how far this had gone. "I told you," she said, voice hushed over the phone. "Your grandfather knew, but he didn't trust the sheriff. Said the county officials were in someone's pocket. We all knew who he meant." "Diane?" I asked. There was a pause. "Number bigger." Those words hung in the air like fog. That night, I sat at Grandpa's desk again. The documents spread around me like war plans. The floor creaked behind me. I turned quickly, startled. Standing in the doorway was a man I hadn't seen in over a decade. "Uncle Ben?" I blinked. He looked older, grayer, but that same hard edge in his eyes. "Robert called me," he said. "Said you're stirring up a hornet's nest." I stood. "I had no idea you were in town." "I wasn't," he said. "But this? This is blood. And the Walkers don't run from fights." For the next few hours, we pored through old family files together. Ben had been helping Grandpa in his final years remotely. Emailing, researching land law, scanning deeds from retirement. Apparently, Grandpa had looped him in once he realized someone was tampering with the records. "There's more," Ben said, pulling out an old manila folder. "Back in '98, there was a sudden shift in zoning for the east side. Guess who signed off on it?" He flipped the page. A signature stared back at me. J. Aldridge, the same Aldridge who now sat on the Redwood County Board of Development. "They've been planning this for years," I whispered. "And they almost pulled it off," Ben said. "But then Grandpa got sick and stalled them. He didn't sign anything, but they kept pushing." I stared down at the documents. They thought this would all go away once Grandpa passed. They were wrong. The next morning, I woke to noise outside the farmhouse. I pulled on boots and stepped onto the porch. 3 white SUVs marked Redwood Valley HOA security idled by the front gate. Men in uniforms leaned against them, watching the house silently. One was holding a camera. Ben appeared beside me. "Intimidation tactics." I stepped down the stairs. "Let's give them something to film." We walked together to the gate. The guard stood upright. "You're trespassing," I said. "Private security. Authorized to patrol HOA assets." "This isn't HOA land. It's mine." He didn't respond. Just clicked a photo and walked back toward the vehicle. Ben leaned in. "Get used to it. They'll escalate now." And he was right. Because later that day, my power was cut, and the water, and the mail never came. They wanted to isolate me, scare me, but I had something they didn't, the truth. And now I had Uncle Ben. And soon, I'd have the entire town. They thought the Walker family ended with Grandpa. They had no idea. By the next morning, word had already started to spread around Redwood Valley. Mrs. Harris had made a few calls, and those few calls turned into many. By noon, the front porch of Grandpa's farmhouse no longer felt like a place of isolation. It had become a quiet headquarters for something much larger than me. Tom Green, the retired electrician Diane had once forced out with endless violations, showed up with 2 other former residents. Then came the Carson family, then the Millers. Some brought old paperwork. Some brought tears. Most brought stories. One by one, they shared their truths. "She fined us every week for leaving our trash cans out 10 minutes too long," Mr. Miller growled. "They said our shutters weren't regulation color," Mrs. Carson added. "They ripped them off without asking." By 3 p.m., 15 people had shown up, all victims of the same HOA tyranny. Some had moved away, others had stayed quiet out of fear. But now something had changed. They'd seen what I was doing, and they were ready to fight back. Robert Mitchell, my lawyer, returned with news. The judge approved the injunction, he confirmed. Construction must stay paused until a full boundary investigation is completed. But his face remained tense. "What is it?" I asked. He set down a manila folder. "We got a name." I opened the folder. The face staring back at me was familiar. James Aldridge, Redwood County Commissioner. Well-dressed, polished, smiling for a ribbon-cutting photo. "He's the one who expedited the development approval process for Diane," Robert explained. "Every form had his signature. And get this, he's a majority shareholder in 2 companies subcontracted for the construction work. He profits if Diane wins." Suddenly this wasn't just about HOA corruption. This was about political power too. The moment chilled me. "So what now?" "Now," Robert said, "we expose them. But we need more voices, more residents, and above all, we need the press." That night I called in a favor. Jessica Harper, an old friend from high school, was now a local journalist. She'd once tried to investigate HOA issues but was shut down by Diane's influence over the paper. I didn't know if she'd answer, but she did. "Ethan Walker?" she said, surprised. "Haven't heard that name since senior year." "I have a story for you," I said. "One you can't ignore, and this time, no one can silence it." There was a pause, then a quiet, determined voice. "Tell me everything." Jessica came by the next morning. She brought a tape recorder and fire in her eyes. As I laid out the documents, Grandpa's surveys, the HOA financial records, and the evidence from residents, I saw her expression shift from curiosity to outrage. "This is a gold mine," she whispered. "Do you realize what you've uncovered? This isn't just fraud. It's a web of coordinated abuse." We worked through the afternoon, Jessica recording interviews with residents who finally found the courage to speak. I watched as she lit a match Diane Reynolds never saw coming. But Diane wasn't finished. That evening, I heard the familiar crunch of gravel. 3 SUVs with Redwood Valley Compliance Unit printed on the sides rolled up the hill. I stepped outside calmly, court injunction in my hand. A woman in a gray suit exited the first vehicle. She didn't smile. "Mr. Walker," she said, "we've received an anonymous tip. We're here to perform an emergency environmental inspection." "What kind of tip?" She pulled out a clipboard. "Possible chemical contamination in the soil, under Section 12B of the HOA Environmental Code." "Are you serious?" I asked, blinking. She stepped forward, indifferent. "If we find anything, the county has the right to seize this property pending a full investigation." They didn't wait. Workers with gloves and scanners moved quickly across the eastern field. Grandpa's old corn rows. "Check there," the inspector barked. "Focus near the irrigation lines." Jessica stood beside me, furious. "This is retaliation. They're trying to fabricate something. You know that, right?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah," I said, fists clenched. "But it also means one thing." "What?" "They're scared. And they should be. Because Redwood Valley was no longer afraid." I didn't sleep that night. My mind kept replaying the scene. My grandfather's name smeared on fraudulent paperwork, the HOA board laughing behind closed doors, and the whispers of neighbors too afraid to speak. But now that was changing. The next morning, the farmhouse felt different. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, but there was tension in the air, like the land itself was holding its breath. I sat at Grandpa's old kitchen table, spreading out the documents once more. Gerald's HOA financials, Tom's tape, and Jessica's printed emails. Everything we needed to bring Redwood Valley's darkest secrets into the light was now in our hands. But I knew the danger wasn't over. Diane may have fallen, but the roots of this corruption ran deeper, and we were just beginning to dig. My phone buzzed. It was Jessica. Jessica Harper. "Ethan, come to the community center. Now something's happening." I grabbed the documents, jumped into my truck, and sped down the gravel road, kicking up clouds of dust behind me. When I arrived, the parking lot was already half full. Residents stood outside, confused, murmuring, looking up at a new banner hastily strung across the entrance. "Emergency vote, HOA reinstatement, today at noon." My blood ran cold. Inside, Diane was standing on the stage, composed, smug, but clearly rattled. She was wearing a sharp navy suit, and beside her stood a man I hadn't seen before. Older, graying at the temples, in an expensive-looking coat. Jessica met me near the entrance, her eyes wide. "That's Roger Vaughn," she whispered. "He's one of Aldridge's lawyers, big-time real estate fixer from the capital." So this was the next move. Diane wasn't acting alone anymore. She had powerful allies coming out of the shadows. "I thought the HOA was dissolved," I muttered. Jessica nodded. "It was, but they're trying to exploit a clause in the bylaws. If 2/3 of the original homeowners vote to reinstate it, it becomes legal again. They're pushing it fast, before the truth spreads too far." Inside, Diane stepped up to the microphone. "Friends," she began, her voice smooth and sugary. "You've heard rumors, lies even. But the truth is, Redwood Valley needs leadership. Without structure, we have chaos. That's why today, we vote to bring back the HOA, with reforms, of course." The crowd murmured. Some nodded, others looked skeptical. That's when I stepped forward. "I have a statement too," I said loudly, climbing the steps of the stage. Diane's smile dropped for half a second. I faced the crowd and held up the manila envelope. "Inside this folder are verified documents, financial records, signed threats, even voice recordings, that prove Redwood Valley's HOA leadership has committed fraud, harassment, and targeted illegal actions against its own residents." Gasps rippled through the room. "We don't need leadership that fines grandmothers for growing tomatoes, that threatens veterans for painting their fences, that steals land and hides behind county officials. We need transparency, community, justice." From the crowd, Tom Green raised his hand. "Ethan's telling the truth. Diane threatened me personally, forced me to sell my house for pennies. I have the tape to prove it." Mrs. Harris stepped up next. "They tried to silence me too. But not anymore." Jessica followed, her voice trembling but clear. "This land belongs to the people who built it, not corrupt lawyers and power-hungry officials." A silence fell over the room. Then slowly, one by one, people began to stand. "I vote no," said Tom. "No reinstatement," echoed a young couple. "I'm with Ethan," said Mrs. Martinez, the schoolteacher. Diane's face began to flush. Vaughn leaned toward her, whispering something, but she snapped back. "I said I could handle this." I stepped up to the microphone one last time. "We have everything we need to expose this in court, but we'd rather fix it here, with the people who live and love this place. Today is your choice." The vote didn't take long. When the final count came in, only 12 residents supported Diane's motion. She stared at the number in disbelief. "No," she whispered. "You're making a mistake. You don't understand the forces you're up against." "We do," I replied calmly, "and we're not afraid anymore." She stormed off the stage, Roger Vaughn following behind, looking less like a fixer now and more like a man who backed the wrong side. After the meeting, neighbors stayed, hugging, crying, and sharing stories they'd been afraid to tell for years. But as I stepped outside into the golden afternoon, My phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Nice speech, Ethan. But the boardroom isn't the battlefield. You just entered ours. It was a text with an attached file, a photo. Jessica's car. Its windows smashed, tires slashed, spray paint across the side. Silence or else. My hands shook with fury. This wasn't over. They'd lost the vote, but they weren't going down quietly. And if the threats were escalating, it meant we were finally hitting the people behind Diane. Hard. I turned to Jessica. We have to move fast. She nodded. Then let's finish what Grandpa started. Roger Vaughn's name echoed through the community like a curse no one dared to utter. Though no one had seen him in years, everyone had heard of him. The shadowy real estate tycoon who quietly acquired failing HOAs across the country, turning them into tightly controlled money machines. And now, he was here. I couldn't sleep. Roger's sudden appearance at Diane's side wasn't just an escalation, it was a declaration. The old games were over. Diane was now backed by someone with real power, real reach, and far fewer moral limits. The following morning, I met Jessica and Robert Mitchell at the farmhouse. My living room had practically turned into a war room. Maps, legal documents, testimonies, and emails littered every surface. Roger Vaughn doesn't just buy land, Robert muttered, flipping through a thick manila folder. He buys silence. He buries people in lawsuits, then builds on the rubble. Jessica added grimly. And he has influence far beyond Redwood Valley. We're talking judges, developers, banks, even state-level politicians. My stomach tightened, but I clenched my fists. We've already brought Diane's empire to its knees. Vaughn is just a bigger version of the same disease. That afternoon, while we were gathering signatures to officially dissolve the old HOA, a massive black SUV pulled into the farmhouse driveway. A well-dressed man in his 60s stepped out slowly, flanked by two silent bodyguards. Roger Vaughn. His tailored gray suit didn't wrinkle as he walked with slow, measured confidence toward my porch. Ethan Walker, he said smoothly. I admire your spirit. I didn't shake his outstretched hand. You're wasting your time, I said evenly. Redwood Valley isn't for sale. He chuckled, a low, practiced sound. Oh, I'm not here to buy. I'm here to warn you. People like me, we don't lose. You can stand on principle, sure, but principles don't pay legal bills. Communities fracture. Neighbors turn. You've stirred up hope, Ethan. But hope dies quickly when the lights go out and the lawsuits pile up. Jessica stood beside me, her arms crossed. We're not afraid of your scare tactics. Vaughn's smile didn't waver. Miss Harper, your employment records show a slight discrepancy. Falsified resume? Would be unfortunate if that reached your new employer. He turned to me. And Ethan, Robert Mitchell is about to face a professional misconduct complaint for representing you. That did it. I stepped forward, fire in my voice. Get off my land. You're not welcome here. His mask cracked, just for a second. I'll give you one last chance. Dismantle this little rebellion and walk away. Otherwise, I promise you'll lose everything. I didn't blink. You're used to crushing people in silence, but we're not afraid of being loud. He stared at me for a long moment before turning back to his SUV. Enjoy your little war, he said, before driving off into the dusk. That night, I called an emergency town hall meeting. This time not in secret. This time, it would be public, televised, and loud. Word spread fast. By 7 p.m., the high school auditorium was packed with over 300 people. News cameras lined the walls. At the center stage stood me, Jessica, Tom Green, Mrs. Harris, and Robert. Vaughn had his money. We had the truth, and the people. Tom Green was first to speak, voice raw with emotion. Diane forced me out. I lost my home. I lost everything. And now she's partnered with a man who turns neighborhoods into fortresses. We can't let them win. Then Mrs. Harris. I've lived here 40 years. I've never seen a community this united. Ethan reminded us we have a voice. It's time we use it. I stepped forward last, my voice steady and resolute. They told us we were powerless. They tried to scare us, isolate us, shut off our water, our electricity. But they didn't count on one thing. We remember who this land belongs to. It belongs to us. Not to Diane, not to Vaughn, not to some board of cowards. Applause erupted. We're forming a new community-led HOA. One with transparency. One with ethics. One that puts people before profit. Jessica handed out official ballots to dissolve the old HOA and elect a temporary community board. As people lined up to vote, I saw something I hadn't seen in weeks, genuine hope. But the fight wasn't over yet. Just as the final vote was cast, a local news anchor rushed to the stage, phone in hand. "Breaking story," she announced breathlessly. "A judge has just approved Vaughn's emergency injunction. He's freezing the community funds and demanding you vacate the farmhouse within 48 hours. A hush fell. I took a deep breath, then raised the microphone. Let him try. The Redwood County Courthouse was packed. Reporters, residents, camera crews, all buzzing with the tension of what was about to unfold. Today wasn't just about land. It was about power, justice, and whether one man could truly stand against a machine designed to crush dissent. I adjusted my tie with trembling hands as I stood outside the courtroom. Jessica gripped my arm. "You've done everything right," she said softly. "Now, let the truth speak." I nodded, swallowing hard. Inside, Roger Vaughn sat arrogantly beside his legal team, polished, powerful, and unfazed. Behind him, several county officials who had once cowered at his command now avoided eye contact. The tide was shifting. Judge Meredith Lowell presided, reputed for her integrity, and, importantly, unaffiliated with Vaughn's political empire. Robert Mitchell stood and began presenting our evidence. First came the verified property surveys, then Gerald's financial spreadsheets, followed by sworn testimonies from residents harassed and displaced by Diane Reynolds under Vaughn's hidden directives. Tom Green's recorded threat from Diane was replayed again for context. Vaughn's lawyers objected at every step. "Circumstantial," they barked. "Fabricated, unfounded." But Judge Lowell allowed it all. Then came the final blow. Robert pulled out a flash drive and plugged it into the courtroom screen. "Your Honor, this footage was captured by a security camera on Gerald Adams' property 2 nights ago." The room fell silent. The screen flickered, then showed grainy night footage. Vaughn himself, flanked by 2 men, unloading barrels marked with toxic waste onto my land. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, reporters typing frantically. Judge Lowell banged her gavel. "Order!" Vaughn's mask cracked. His smug grin vanished. His lawyer leaned in, whispering furiously. Vaughn stood suddenly. "This is a setup," he barked. "You don't know who you're dealing with. I built this town." "You buried poison on private farmland to frame a citizen," Judge Lowell replied coldly. "You're under arrest for environmental crimes, conspiracy, bribery, and fraud." Deputies surrounded him. As they cuffed him, he glared at me. "You think this is over, Walker? There are others, bigger than me." "I know," I said quietly. "And I'll face them too." As he was led away, the room stood in stunned silence. Then, slowly, people began to clap. First Mrs. Harris, then Gerald, then the entire courtroom erupted in applause. For the first time in years, Redwood Valley was breathing again. 2 weeks later, a town hall was held, this time not under fear, but hope. The Redwood Valley community voted to dissolve the old HOA charter entirely. In its place, we established the Redwood Valley Cooperative, built on transparency, fairness, and democratic participation. Gerald was appointed treasurer, this time by vote. Jessica became the community liaison. Robert agreed to advise pro bono. And me? I moved into Grandpa's house permanently, not as a fighter anymore, but as a caretaker of a legacy. The farm's eastern fields were converted into a community garden and learning center. The old barn became a cooperative workspace for artisans and local farmers. The land once marked for luxury estates now served as a green space open to everyone, preserved, not plundered. One evening, I stood by Grandpa's grave, the wind gently swaying the trees. "We did it," I whispered. "They tried to erase you. But you were right all along. This land didn't just belong to us. It belonged to everyone who was willing to fight for what was right." I looked out over the valley. Children laughed in the distance, neighbors worked side by side, and the sun dipped behind the trees, golden and warm. Jessica joined me, slipping her hand into mine. "What now?" she asked. I smiled. "Now, we protect what we built. Together." Because the fight was never just about a farmhouse. It was about standing your ground. And sometimes, that's all it takes to change everything.